Now, Annie Machon is a former British intelligence officer. In fact, since she left, they've not been nearly as intelligent. They would have been better holding on to her. She was an intelligence officer in the MI5 service, and she knows a lot about Libya, and in particular, the Belhaj case. There's nothing she doesn't know about it. In fact, she's going to be speaking about all of it and more in London on the 19th of June, and I, for one, will be in her audience. We'll get the details of that now because we're going to talk to Annie Machon. Annie, welcome to the show.
Hello, George. Thank
Hi.
you for inviting me on.
Not at all. Let's get the 19th of June out the way first. Where are you speaking? How do people get tickets?
I'm speaking in Shoreditch, a place called the Eastern Palms, and they can find me on a website called funzing.com, which puts on events across London every night.
Okay, and is it one night only?
This time it is, yes. I've been doing this talk on and off over the last few years in London. It usually gets quite interesting reviews. I'm trying to sort of make sense of what goes on, what is going on across the Middle East, why all these wars are happening, what is behind it, and trying to give a bit of structure to how we can analyse what the hell is going on.
Well, you better keep the next night free because I think our listeners here will provide exceptional demand that will require more than one night only in East London. So let's start, if we can, with the Belhaj case, which we both know well. I know Mr. Belhaj well. I know his wife well. And they got justice of a sort, at least today. Tell us how you saw it.
Well, I want to dig back over 20 years to the start of all this story. Because when I worked in MI5, my former colleague and former partner, David Shaler, was the head of the Libyan section. And in 1996, MI6 paid the group that Abdel Hakim Belhaj had part-founded up to about $120,000 to...
This was the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, LIFG.
That's right, yes. And MI6 funded them to try and carry out an assassination attempt against Colonel Gaddafi in 1996. And the attack was illegal under UK law because they did not get prior ministerial permission from the Foreign Secretary. And it went wrong, and innocent people died. And manifestly, Gaddafi survived to be assassinated in 2011. So this is why David went public. This is why he blew the whistle. And Abdel Hakim Belhaj and his group, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, were in the frame for this, but they were working with our MI6, our external intelligence gathering agency, at this time. So then you fast forward to 2004, and Gaddafi has apparently made an accommodation to give up his non-existent weapons of mass destruction in the wake of what happened to Iraq and the invasion in 2003. And there is the famous deal in the desert made between Tony Blair, our Prime Minister at the time, and Colonel Gaddafi, where they started to work together against the threat of al-Qaeda terrorism. And at this point, this is when apparently Abdel Hakim Belhaj was spotted. He was located by MI6, who had worked with him only 8 years before. He was handed over by MI6 and arrested in Malaysia in 2004, along with his pregnant wife. And at that point, he was then taken to Bangkok, held in a secret CIA prison, which was probably being run by Gina Haspel, the new head of the CIA, by the way.
We'll come to her in a moment, because our friend Ray McGovern can't be contacted because he's in jail, having been beaten up, disrupting the hearing.
Yet again, yes, we will get onto that. But so Abdel Hakim Belhaj and his wife were flown 18 hours from Bangkok to Libya. They were strapped down on the floor of a military plane, he and his pregnant wife. And then he was held for 6 years in the Abu Salam prison in Libya, and he was tortured for 6 years. So he was handed over, and we know this now as a gift by MI6 to Gaddafi. And we know this because after the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, papers were found in the offices of the former head of the Libyan intelligence agency, the offices of a man called Musa Kusa, who had fled. And they showed that the head of counterterrorism in MI6, a man called Samark Allen at the time, writing a letter to Musa Kusa saying, please take this gift effectively. We found him for you, the CIA transported him for you, and see this as an offering of goodwill for our future work together. Now, Sir Mark Allen was also cited by Abdel Hakim Belhaj in his legal cases in the UK. He's never been held to account. And he resigned eventually from MI6 and then took a very highly paid position in BP, which then got lots of lucrative oil deals in Libya, while Libya and the UK were still on friendly terms before the overthrow of Gaddafi.
Let me stop you there, Annie, before continuing, because whilst for you and I, this is meat and drink. This is ABC. Some of our listeners may have become lost. We were supporting the terrorist opposition to Gaddafi. Then we delivered some of the terrorist opposition to Gaddafi to Gaddafi's torture tables. And then we backed the terrorist opposition to Gaddafi to overthrow Gaddafi and murder him.
Absolutely. That's it in a nutshell.
It is in a nutshell, but it's a rather bizarre nutshell, isn't it? What would be the thinking behind it?
The thinking behind the attempted coup in the 1990s was that MI6, one of its priority targets, was to try and catch the alleged perpetrators of the Lockerbie bombing. And they kept failing. So they saw this as a sort of way of saying we can still do things. I mean, they have a slightly sort of James Bond wannabe type thinking going on quite often. So I remember when David was briefed about this, he was the head of the Libyan desk in MI5, he was briefed by his official counterpart in MI6. When he was officially briefed, he was concerned about it, but he asked if it was a legal operation, and they said yes, it had gone all the way to the top, i.e. it had been signed off by the Foreign Secretary. And then he didn't hear anything about it for months, so he assumed it was one of these sort of crazy ideas that never came to fruition, which MI6 did a lot of it those days. And then, of course, he did see the proof that an attack had indeed gone ahead and it had killed innocent people but failed in its target. So that certainly happened in the 1990s. And by going public about this attempted assassination of a foreign head of state in the 1990s, David Shayler, who was my colleague and partner at the time, was imprisoned twice for trying to blow the whistle on this criminality on the part of MI6. So you have a situation where MI6 is funding a known al-Qaeda affiliate group in 1996. MI5 had started investigating al-Qaeda as a known terrorist group in 1995. And the attack still goes wrong. I mean, it's crazy. And then, yes, Gaddafi was then befriended by Tony Blair and rehabilitated with the West. And then he was targeted again by David Cameron's government. And he was attacked. The same groups were funded again by the West and helped by the West to overthrow Gaddafi in 2011. And he was captured, and he was tortured, and he was murdered. So the whole thing is so dark and dirty. And I think the whole thing revolves...
Dark, dirty and absurd, actually. I mean, not so much James Bond as Austin Powers, really, because the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the clue being in the name, didn't disappear at that point, did it? Because when the explosives went off in the Manchester Arena, and I was only a few hundred yards away from it when it did, who was it that carried out the mass murder of our children in the Manchester Arena less than a year ago, but a child of a member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group?
Absolutely, Abi Sadi. And he had also gone over, as a very young man in 2011, with his brother to fight against Gaddafi. So, you know, all these people are known. All these people are allowed to run free and do their thing if MI6 sees that there might be an advantage politically in it. But then MI6 is a very fickle friend. And if they then decide that that group, your group, might be an enemy, then you can be snatched, extraordinarily rendered, and tortured for years, as Abdel Hakim Belhaj found out to his cost.
Did any of these people read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? And if so, did they read it to the end? Do they know what happens when you make a Frankenstein monster? It gets out of your control, and that's why it's called a monster.
Indeed. I mean, it's the classic case of my enemy's enemy is my friend. until they become my enemy again. And that happens time and time and time again.
It is extraordinary. Now, I mean, you're bound by, I'm sure, any number of official secrets, acts, and so on. So I don't want to embarrass you and refuse to answer me if you must. But was anybody in your service conscious of the fact that building up this Frankenstein might not be the best idea?
I do have to be careful in answering this, but I will say that I mean, this is 20 years ago, of course, so it's a long time ago. But there were many, many, many of us within our sort of peer group, our age range of sort of middle-ranking officers who had ethical concerns. And there was a flood of officers resigning from the service at that point because of that.
Interesting. I shan't press you on that. Let me fast forward then to last night. Another of our wonderful foreign policy wheezes was played out on the occupied Golan Heights last night. Mm-hmm. We now have a military standoff, and it's not dark yet. It might be getting dark in Damascus now. We now have a military standoff in which the Syrian army, Hezbollah, the Iranian irregulars, the Revolutionary Guards, the Russian armed forces, the Israeli armed forces, are all daggers drawn, missiles pointed, in one of the most combustible parts of the entire globe, and the proximate cause for the kickoff is Donald Trump walking away from and thus destroying the Iran nuclear deal. As I joked earlier, Annie, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, when they started, when France, the UK and the USA decided to retaliate against the so-called Duma chemical attack a few weeks ago, I was sitting there just thinking, this is the start of World War III. This is terrifying, because Russia and Iran were both invited in by the Assad government in Syria to try and help Assad beat the terrorist oppositions, which included ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And they did that, and they did that very, very effectively. And yet every time Assad seemed to be on the point of victory, some new so-called chemical weapon atrocity occurred, which was blamed on his government. And now we've got a situation where even that's not holding water. People are very suspicious. They don't believe what their governments are saying. So suddenly it's sort of escalating to the fact that Israel is known to want to start a war against Iran, and they have been committing airstrikes against Iranian forces which are legally in Syria. And now, of course, now Israel's making a big fuss about the fact that there has been retaliation from the Iranian forces legally in Syria against the illegal Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. So this could kick off big time. And I think the fact that Trump has been pressurized into pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal is incredibly dangerous. But we know that Iran has always been on the target list of the neocons in America. And we know this from the Project for the New American Century report that came out in 1999. Rebuilding America's Defenses was the name of the report. And this listed the countries that America needed to control over the next couple of decades in order to protect the energy reserves in the Middle East. And well, no surprise, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and North Korea. Those are 5 countries that are mentioned in that report. And all of those 5 countries have been in the crosshairs of the American government and, by extension, the Israeli government.
As I say, what could possibly go wrong? Annie, there'll be plenty of people at your meeting on the 19th. Remind us again, 19th of June, in what was the venue?
It's called Eastern Palms in Shoreditch. But
Palms, P-A-L-M-S.
Exactly, but the whole event is organised by a company called funzing.com, and that's where you can find the talk.
Spell that for me.
funzing.com.
I'll be there, and I encourage anyone with any sense to be there. My goodness, can you not get back into MI5? Because we badly need somebody with intelligence in our intelligence service. Annie Machon, thank you very much for gracing the mother of all talk shows.